Today I'm talking with Joey Brite. Joey, you are an activist, a lesbian, and the producer of the Can I Get a Witness conference. And I'm super excited to have you here talking to us today because I think
Thank
you
you.
have a really important perspective. And you've reached out to me a few times to sort of, we've had some discussions about,
Mhm, mhm,
where do we stand on this? Where do we move forward on this? And I think
mhm,
that with your conference, there were really a lot of important ideas that came out of it. So
mhm.
I'm just going to give you the floor.
You want me to talk about the conference specifically?
You can talk about whatever you want that you think is topical right now.
Okay, well, yeah, there's so many things. I think that one of the things, and thank you so much for having me, Erin, because yes, I know that, there's a million, we're bombarded by so many different choices really of things to do. And the content that you have been providing on your channel is not being seen enough. And, the variety and of course, all this stuff around identity. And one of the things that I had reached out to you for, I know, is that while some friends of mine and I predicted more than 10 years ago that around now, so in around 2010, we were talking about, we meaning like a handful of other older second wavers like myself, talked about how there's going to be a wave, a flood, a tidal wave of women who are going to regret that they started down the path of even taking testosterone.
And
We
that
were
was
talking
10
about
years ago. So you already
that.
sort
That
of
was that was just the prediction that there was going to be
had, wow.
a tidal wave of predominantly young, and at that time we're talking in 2010. So, it's a while ago. I'm in my 60s now. I've been fighting this thing for over 30 years. People, they're just upset after they've been involved in it for 2 years ago. And oh my God, I'm like,
So what was it that you saw happening that
so yeah, I'd like to go a little bit in the past about that and why, yes, in 2010, here's a small group of lesbian feminists looking at, oh my God, our community is gone. I mean, it was gone pretty much by the mid 90s.
oh,
Not that anybody on the outside, tourists coming from outside of the Bay Area or even in San Francisco, if they came to the parade, which happens every last Sunday in June, people see, they just see a mass now that we're talking about, more than 600,000 people.
oh wow.
So my first parades and whatnot in the Bay Area was back in the 80s. And what we saw in our community started really prominently around 1984, 1985. And in 1985, there's a very prominent person female, who we just all knew as a more, you want to say, masculinized. It's this whole notion now where we really have to come up with language about range, and it doesn't have to be just masculine, feminine in the lesbian community, just butch or femme. It's
Mhm.
really this non-conforming idea, because now, of course, I have several straight women friends who said, I was a tomboy, I was non-conforming, and if I had these options now, I probably would have done it too, and it's just the state of being female. But the idea of any male or female being able to exhibit a range in presentation, in likes, in things that we do, musical instruments, any of that stuff. So there was a very large, thriving lesbian community in San Francisco. I mean, it's one of the homes when people think about the basis for things. And there was a very large, very active things that had really, started taking place in the 70s, where literally, I was in Southern California. We had a feminist credit union. We started to deal with our own money. We had 4 bookstores. Up here in the Bay Area, there were 3 bookstores. There were 4, and then it went to 3. There were 6 or 7 women's bars. Now, that was a carryover from the 40s and 50s. A lot of people have negative attitudes about that. It was an extremely positive cultural thing for many, many women, because it was one of the only places that we could meet. Not everybody was drinking. We were dancing, playing games, actually having political meetings in the back room, things like that you'd do in a booth in any cafe. And those were our cultural places. And after the credit unions, the bookstores, small businesses. I was with 4 other women, and we were the head of a co-op, a food co-op, one of those early ones where you would work 15 hours a month or something, and you would get a discount, or you get all these things, for free
I
for
wonder
working.
if you worked with my mom. She was involved in that in San Francisco about that time. Probably.
Well, when I did that, I was in San Diego actually
Oh,
at that
okay.
time,
Yeah,
but yeah, I mean, a lot of that was going on in California,
yeah.
all over. And all of that stuff, we were getting used to it. I mean, if my car was broken down, we had not just women mechanics, we had lesbian mechanics. And I mean, the community of straight people that were allies with lesbians mostly, um, knew that these things existed and they could partake in them as well. And it was beginning to be a thriving community. And so by the 80s, when I moved to San Francisco, I thought even more so, and it was. And the East Bay was really thriving. San Francisco, the politics kind of between the East Bay and San Francisco, like in a lot of cities, depending on the geography, things can be a little bit, different. But the parade was something that was fun. Um, there, every year was something we looked forward to. There were lots of contingencies in the parade itself by women. Most of them were they were either mocking straight culture in a way, women carrying signs that I support ironing and staying at home. It was like these mock fun. And one year, I remember seeing this organization. I said, "What's that?" And there were all these men in, now they're calling them these puppy outfits and things like that.
Furry.
They were with an organization called NAMBLA, the North American Man Boy Love Association.
Oh,
We
yikes.
saw, yeah, I was there with about 4 friends, and we saw like 6 guys. They were a contingency, and this was an organization, and we lost our minds and we complained. And it was, again, lesbians that got rid of NAMBLA because if nothing else, the fact somebody like me who wanted to get a teaching credential, and I decided I better not, because I knew 3 different friends who had all been fired as teachers for doing nothing, touching a child's shoulder. Some other teacher saw that and said that this person had not just touched the child, but the child got upset, and then they tried to hug them. They did a whole scenario, and this woman I knew got fired. She was an incredible teacher, incredible person, and it broke her. And that was
And what I wanted to just get at, though, that's really interesting is that you had a group come into the parade that could create a lot of backlash for LGBT people having NAMBLA there
you
represented.
think you'd think, but the gay men were okay with it at the
Oh, so
time.
that's interesting,
It
because I
was
was going
part
to
of
say
the
that you felt
expression.
empowered to tell them, no, you're not part of this. But the gay men actually felt okay about it.
The thing is that gay men, by and large, of course, there are exceptions, but by and large, gay men do not get involved necessarily politically
Okay.
unless there's something that affects them. And the thing about the parade has always been that it was the one day of the entire year where we would all hope we had each other's backs and nobody was going to get arrested and no one was going to lose their job. And, of course, there were no cell phones running around. You weren't, there were a lot of people taking photographs and stuff, but there was no digitization of no one was running around with a lot digital cameras or anything like that. But when a small group of us, lesbians, saw this, and we knew that this absolutely went against our values and what we were trying to get away from, a lot of the younger people, what they don't realize is what a weight it is to come out as a homosexual. Any same-sex attention brought to you at all also meant that equaled pedophilia. That is just a carryover from, decades before. So we tried to, try to discourage that as much as possible. But the gay men that were still very much in control of the parade at that time, still up into the 80s, I mean, it was known as the Gay Freedom Parade. We had to fight for 11 years before they called it the Lesbian and Gay Freedom Day Parade. And that shadow and that sort of horror, because of course, I think a couple of the friends I was with that year when we saw that, they're mothers.
Yeah.
And women in general, even though I don't have children, but I've always had children in my life. And the idea of that was abhorrent to me. So we had to tell the men that were running the parade at the time, you cannot have
Yeah.
a contingency like that. This is not about sexual orientation. This is a fetish. Now, I'm telling you, this is
Oh,
more
they're
than
predators.
30 years ago.
Yeah,
The
I
same
mean,
things that we're saying now,
wow.
we were trying to get this pedophilic organization out of the contingencies where people are celebrating, having fun. Yeah, and a lot of gay men would be, you know, more than half nude, and some of them completely nude during the day. And the San Francisco Police Department protected the parade itself because it wasn't, back in those days, it was getting, I mean, it got bigger and bigger every year. But even though as women and as lesbians, we didn't love, you know, seeing men with their full packages hanging out somewhere, it wasn't that it overrided the entire thing. And there were women that took their tops off and felt great because it was like the one time. I mean, that's the most, you knew you weren't going to get arrested, and there weren't really tourists around. There weren't like other people. It was our community. So there was a celebration and a sensation of, again, one day a year. Please don't arrest us. Don't do anything. I mean, this is what Stonewall broke, all those rules, right? So
But
now,
you know, just from my perspective as a mom, and I was always an ally when I was younger. I was, you know, always donating to organizations to support LGBT. And if I had seen a group that represented pedophiles there, my, you know, my mama bear would have come out, and you would
yeah,
have all support. And I think that's part of what's happening now, is that, you know, someone like me who historically has been very supportive of the community is pulling back and saying, wait a minute, what is it that I'm supporting now? I'm not real happy with where this is going. And so the fact that this actually was an issue that long ago is interesting to me, and that they felt emboldened to actually come as a contingent to the parade is somewhat disturbing.
well, you used to have to pay. It's funny because I did do a contingency one year, and I wanted to know more like, what's the process of this? Because the parade did get bigger and bigger. And I mean, it would start at like, you know, 10 o'clock in the morning, lining up in downtown San Francisco, and it went on for blocks. And I mean, there were literally more than 100, you know, contingencies or whatever. And you'd have to pay like $30, fill out a form, and send it to the parade committee ahead of time. So I could imagine at that time, I'm not sure if people were doing that back in the 80s when NAMBLA showed up. It was a practice sometimes. It was so free that you could show up and actually grab 2 or 3 friends and say, let's take our signs in and we'll be a contingency.
Right.
And then they made it more regulated. So I think this happened before that. But yeah, it went against everything. But there was this introduction that, again, this wasn't about sexual orientation, but the gay men just saw it as something that was a deviant part of gay male culture, and they should allow it. And we had arguments that went on. So here we are now, and you have, where are the men? You know, where are the men? So it's always been that, and lesbians have been at the forefront of that a lot. And so back going from the 80s, and by 1990, I went to the parade with a partner, and we were watching and lamenting about how we had started to see for the last 5 years. So I say from 1985, there was this one woman who chose to start becoming the experiment for testosterone. And I was somebody
85.
who, yeah,
Wow.
she did this in 85. And what she did was basically got a double mastectomy, nothing, as they say, downstairs, donned leather, did bodybuilding with the testosterone, and turned herself into a porn star. And the community of the more like younger lesbians, or the lesbians that were more, again, gender non-conforming, and seeing this person who seemed to show up at all these sort of LGBT things, you know, doing this and, you know, all this stuff, it became kind of like a fad. And some non-conforming, again, were a lot of insecure, really, because women that were really on the butch end in lesbian culture, and I was one of those, were trying to always figure out, how do we fit in? You know, it was a thing of always, and it's no different because we're women. How do we change ourselves rather than changing the world, you know? And I've been an activist forever. And so I had this conflict always going on, because I thought, this shouldn't have to be about me, how I look, how I present, the things I like, who I want to be romantic with shouldn't be about making other people feel comfortable. This should be that they accept, and incorporate that, just like a very effeminate, young boy. And there's the conflict, because we're also given the message all the time, as women, that we have to fix whatever it is. So there's that going on. So around 1985, I had already been myself thinking, I think I have to be a guy. I mean, I've felt like that since I was a tiny kid.
Would you consider that gender dysphoria, or do you think it's just because of social stereotypes and expectations?
I think that not that it doesn't exist, and not that it's something that's real, but I think that gender dysphoria and dysphoria itself is thrown around as a catch-all, and it's very mysterious and confusing to people. And that isn't anything. It's like misgendering. If I was going to be, trying to get reparations for every time I've been misgendered, I mean, I never had a hissy fit. If somebody called me sir or ma'am, when they'd recognize I was a female, I was like, oh, yay, I'm happy. That's a good thing. But because I got so many sirs, I mean, I knew why I did. I mean, look at me now. It's not that different. Here's a picture of me when I'm 27.
Wow,
Okay.
that's a great
That's
picture.
so there's that thing of somebody says gender dysphoria, and it's like, that wasn't even a thought, Erin. It was about really bullying, being concerned about being discriminated against, all of those things. It wasn't just like, oh, I'm always thinking that, looking in the mirror and the way that people will talk. I was not really comfortable with my body. That is true.
Well, and that's the
But I think
question is,
it's
when I
like,
think of gender dysphoria, I think of my experience with it, which is just this hatred towards my female body.
mhm,
And I think maybe we talk a lot about language, and I feel like gender dysphoria, I was more comfortable with the gender identity disorder diagnosis. That made more sense. But again, even that is very based in stereotypes. And so I
correct.
think we almost need to come up with a new diagnosis for women and girls who have such intense hatred of their bodies that they want to be a male. I mean, and it's not penis envy, it's way bigger than that.
And, you may disagree, and I'm going to say there is a diagnosis. It's called misogyny. I think that we suffer incredibly as little girls. And when you're a little girl that fantasizes about being, as an older woman, that you're going to be with somebody, you start looking at movie stars and you like the teacher and you get a crush on the female teacher, and you can't tell anybody except maybe your closest little male friend who has a crush on the teacher too. That happened with me. And that it's not okay, and that it's not right. And again, for me, growing up in the growing up from the late 50s through the 60s, all of the films, and I'm a film fanatic, and stories that I would read in books, and I read a lot of biographies. When I was 13 years old, I read Christine Jorgensen's autobiography. That was my equivalent to today or yesteryear's Tumblr, I think. I read a story about a man, and anybody can see this, Christine Jorgensen, and he was one of the first successful, supposedly, because I don't believe we can ever change sex. Even Christine Jorgensen, I think, had said that later in life. But anyway, going back to San Francisco, 1985, being involved in a very large, women's music industry, all kinds of things going on, women's films, all this stuff. Here's this one individual in the community who never was really part of the political or social scene really around other lesbians that were doing things and being, a lot of us, we were involved politically because we were always fighting for women's rights as well. Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon, I don't know if those names mean anything to you. They were in San Francisco, and they were sort of these stalwart, role models for a lot of women because they'd come out so early. But anyway, along comes testosterone. Now, I said that you asked me about gender dysphoria, but I really thought that I was supposed to be a guy. That was it. I thought I had to change me in order to be accepted. And so we're looking at the external and what creates the external, just like what created the internal for me. So that's why I say I believe it's all based in misogyny. And until women deal with that and look at that. They're not going to love their bodies. And it's a long journey for most everybody I know to really love their bodies, to really understand what's going on, you know, inside. And I'm not just talking about sexuality, but that's a big part of it, especially if you're not the majority, you're not straight. And so I had lucked out myself, went to a psychotherapist because I knew I had already plotted out the route. And when this woman in 85
Oh,
did
so
what
you
she
were
did,
planning on taking
yes,
testosterone. Okay.
yeah, I was psychologically, I was on track. I decided that was it because I decided I knew I wasn't going to really become a man, but I was going to be some sort of version of a man. Basically, passing was going to be a good thing because I was going to be a better man. I was going to be a better man because I came out of a female life.
Right.
I saw the oppression that men had. I also worked in the trades. I knew men. Men would talk to me about all kinds of things. They would tell me stuff they wouldn't talk to the other men about. And men are also big gossips. They always think that it's just women because I've been in the trades. I've been in that world and I was around men. And anyway, I thought, yeah, I was on a psychological track, but I thought I'm going to help fix things. I'm going to go out and help rescue.
Kind of infiltrate the male community and as a male be able to affect change, it sounds like.
That's it.
Yes.
That's it right there. It's that thing of I'm going to rescue women and girls and boys and kids and protect them. And I'm going to do all that because it's only having the mind and the life experience of being in a female body, understanding rape, battery, abandonment, you know, abortion, any of these issues that have to do with our very core of being female. Whether or not we can birth children, the fact that we have wombs is what makes us so different. So yeah, that was going to be my mission. I was going to become a better man, which is funny because I'm only 5'2.5". And like
Hey, you're
this
taller than me.
and, and like this woman that I'm talking about in 85, if you saw her, which she then, you know, she did go into the porn industry, and there she'd be walking down, you know, Castro Street with a group of gay leather men, and you'd look at her right away and know that's not a man. And you never see her today surrounded by other men, because as soon as you see her with other men, you only see her by herself. And she's super buff. She's done this for 25 years. If you see her with other men, you know right away that's not a man. Just the way that a dog or a cat, they know the difference between men and women.
Right.
So this idea of trickery or, you know, concern about leaving the house and feeling like a liar, you know, some of this it's of course, all of that stuff is there. But in 85, I was on that psychological track, and I knew what the process was. You had to wait 2 years. You had to wait 2 years before you could even touch testosterone.
Wow.
You had to prove, and it's a lot easier for women than it is for a very effeminate gay man, particularly the other men that I associated with. You had to live as the opposite sex. Well, like I said, I've got straight women friends that said, I was wearing pants, I was an executive, I did whatever, you know, was that man enough for society? You know, and they're straight. And, but you had to prove that you were living as the opposite sex, take on a male name, start to tell your family or your loved ones or whatever. You'd have to have some sort of support system around you. And you'd be going twice a week to psychotherapy and talking about your, you know, your issues and why you wanted to transition, all that. See, they didn't have an affirmation model. It was all about exploring who you are and needing to prove that also before you could go for the gold. And the gold was to get testosterone, because everybody wanted to have the mustache. This is a fake, hang on, I'm sorry. Okay, that's a fake mustache. That's actually made of my own hair.
Awesome.
This is the fun that we used to have. This is what my culture has been. We used to be able to have fun like that, and now you wouldn't dare catch me going out of the house like that, because people, you know, asking me, oh, are you trans? Are you going to trans? You know, as if it's this thing. But anyway, back then I picked a therapist, and I wanted to find a butch woman therapist because I thought she'll understand me. She'll fast track this somehow. She'll make it better for me. So you had to do the psychotherapy twice a week. And then the psychotherapist, who's not a psychologist, would be working with a psychologist. Then the psychologist, you'd have to get a psychiatrist. And now you were starting to get towards that, you know, the end of the yellow brick road, and you're going to get, you know, hopefully testosterone. So you could get the mustache, or get the sideburns, and prove, prove, and your voice would, you know, I wanted all of that. I wanted to be, you know, on this other side of that, and then start my journey. I was going to either do social work at that point or something, you know, officially. Then I could really save women and children, right? That was my whole thing. So I'm on that. What do? I get a butch therapist, psychotherapist, and I think that I'm getting it down the way that kids these days have read on the internet everything they're supposed to say. Here's the script. I had no internet. We had gossip, and we knew, and we talked to other women, and they said, this is what you're going to have to do. And, you know, that. So I go to this psychotherapy session, the very first session, and she says to me, you're not a man. You're never going to be a man. You are a lovely soul. This is almost verbatim. So you're a lovely soul who's gone astray. And we're going to work together, and I'm going to help you to love yourself and find out why you think in your mind that you have to please the world. This is a classic female, she said, conundrum that we all have in many different ways, whether it's a wife pleasing her husband, a woman pleasing her boyfriend, a mother pleasing her children, a girlfriend pleasing another girlfriend, or, you know,
And you know, the interesting thing is, Joey, is that if a girl went in today, that therapist, if she said exactly what she said to you, that could be considered illegal.
I know.
Because now they have the therapy bans. And so, I mean,
again, this is back in the 80s, and I was in a good, you know, it was a fairly new relationship at the time, and I didn't even tell her. I thought I'd tell her as I was getting closer to the goal.
right.
But during this time, I'm not the only one that's doing this. So anyway, my story was that this therapist got me. I was a blubber of tears, you know, by the time that first session was over. And I worked with her for about another 6 months, and which wasn't a long time in terms of when you think about doing psychotherapy with somebody for a long time. But we moved mountains. And even though I still had this kind of lingering doubt, because what am I dealing with? Society on the outside. I'm in the trades, so I'm constantly around men who are telling me in a way, you know, all the messages. There wasn't any direct personal, but I did mention to my partner at the time, I'm thinking of doing this. How do you feel about it? And she said, well, I'm not going to be able to be with you. And I was shocked, because I was so wrapped in not just my pain of not feeling fitting in fully, but I said, you know, I thought you loved me. And she said, I do. And that's a reason also I would not support you doing that. And the moment that you take that journey, everything in the world is going to be about you. Whatever you're doing with, you know, the pills or the shots or the this or the that, the health issues that will come up. And she said all this stuff. Again, this is like 1990. She's saying this to me. This is 5 years. But what that young woman at the time did in the community, where there were many others who felt much like I did, either they had, like me, a lifelong of feeling sort of tortured about that, or they had recently come out, or they were just tired of, maybe they had been rape survivors. They had been like most women I know, honestly, most women I know have been survivors of some kind of sexual abuse or taunting or something. And a lot of these women, we see this bodybuilder. Yeah, it's bizarre. She's in not just porn, but gay male porn. Okay. And a lot of these women were like, well, she looks pretty happy. She's kind of a rock star. And my friends and I were going, uh-oh. Uh-oh. Because we saw the facial hair. We saw the posturing. Everything was an imitation. And as a butch woman, I know about posturing. I know about helping to build an exterior, to put a wall in a way so that I don't have the same issues, I think, as my very feminine partner or my friends. I had some very tough very feminine friends who were very tough when it came down to it. when
So
we
Joey,
physically
just out of
accosted.
curiosity, you're kind of being careful about talking about the name of this person. Is this someone that is sort of in the new
Yeah, I don't
in the
want to
know
name them,
now?
but yeah, they're in the
Or
they're now
someone who
calling
is
themselves a
influential?
gender critical, trans, and that's the
Okay.
whole.
So because there are a couple of people who are kind of gaining notoriety,
Mhm.
having some influence, who are coming out saying, I'm transgender, but it doesn't mean I changed sex.
And I think it's hypocritical. I think it's dangerous, and I think it's hypocritical.
And you're saying
Having,
this person, who I think I know who you're talking about, you're saying
I
that
said, I'm not going to say the name of
no,
this
but you
person,
said
but
that she has had a huge influence on
yes,
other girls and women
yes,
transitioning. So even though she
yeah,
comes out and says she's gender critical,
yeah.
the very fact that she went through this whole thing and is now very popular
Mm.
does influence people
Yes.
potentially to go down that route.
Yes, and it's even the thing of, like I said, the thing about what myself and a lot of women in, not just, it started on the West Coast, but I know it went up the coast, Oregon and Washington, down to Los Angeles. And then, of course, a lot of things that happen in California, cultural, in the entertainment business and all that, popular cultural stuff goes boom. It either has started in New York or it started in California, but they tend to just like go like this. And all of a sudden, again, this is still pre-internet. Anecdotally, the remaining of my community, which we were watching every year, the lesbian and gay parade was a great place to see what's going on, because it wasn't just the parade, but you'd have a film festival, a gay and lesbian film festival that went on for 10 days. And it culminated on the end of that day when the big parade would happen on a Sunday. The content changed of the films. There used to be, and not that everything was really high quality, because you're looking at, getting worldwide films. And this is the Frameline Film Festival. They are the oldest and the largest distributor of gay and lesbian content in the world. And what started happening with that was, all of a sudden, in the late 80s, we started seeing films that were not just geared, even if they were bad films, I'm talking documentaries, narratives, shorts, and there were comedies and science fiction, and I mean, every genre you could imagine. And we would always vote on the films afterwards. And all of a sudden, we moved from having a lot of serious documentaries, funny stories, serious narratives, dramas, and exploring, same-sex love throughout the world. Maybe somebody would have snuck a film out from Thailand at the time, because it's illegal or something like that. All of a sudden, we start seeing more content that's involving suicidality,
Hmm.
people that are confused about their bodies, whether they're male or female, young, effeminate gay men who start thinking maybe they're really female. We see, kind of in a way, drag used to be funny. Drag used to be very effeminate gay men who had zero interest in staring at women or coming into their bathrooms, other than, and I never had a problem, seriously, in a social situation where there's a public bathroom, and there's like, often in the bars there'd be one bathroom maybe, but there was usually men's and women's. A gay effeminate man who was either doing drag professionally or not, I had no problem with a 6-foot guy coming in for a moment to fix his lipstick, maybe even take a pee and go. None of us ever worried or felt like we were going to possibly be attacked, that there was anything. Very different than the 12-year-old girl now who can look up in the stall and there's a man staring at her. Those are not the old drag queens that I used to know. Not that, anyway, drag and all that, things in our culture, in both the gay culture and lesbian culture, we had differences, and we had things that we also understood about each other that were not threatening, particularly from gay men. And again, that's been stolen at this point, I feel, because again, pedophilia. When we look at this idea that we're going to become so distanced from our sexed bodies that we don't even know who we are, that we get to this thing of non-binary. means nothing. Except for women, what that means is you're erasing yourself
Mm-hmm.
even more,
Mm-hmm.
because as women we're already supposed to be doing this, and now you just bought into something, or you're erased even more. And for white
Well, and
men,
the ironic thing to me when I see someone who talks about being non-binary, they don't ever say I'm non-binary and stay the same. They say I'm
yeah,
non-binary and then they have their breasts chopped off, or they say they're non-binary and then they get on estrogen. And so it's like it's to me it's just another kind of muddling of this whole narrative that, you know, it's somehow they're uncomfortable with who they are. And it really, when you talk about this woman who went on to take testosterone and became a bodybuilder and then started making porn, it really, to me, is just another kind of sad story about this body hatred. I mean, it's really, I can't imagine doing porn if you really loved yourself, in all honesty. And I'm sure that I'll catch some crap for that. But as someone who's made porn, it's not something that you do when you love yourself. It's not an affirming experience. It's very degrading and
mm-hmm.
dangerous and
Mm-hmm.
harmful, and not something that someone does when they're, you know, well centered in themselves. And so,
Mm-hmm.
you know, this non-binary is now another. It's sort of like we're not coming out as trans. We're coming out as something sort of even more mysterious and different than that, and
Mm-hmm.
saying that we don't have a sexed self at all or something.
Yeah, it's almost like this thing with non-binary. It's interesting you make that connection there with porn too, because I come out of I've done many things, and you know, for work and for pleasure, for political reasons and whatever. One of the things that I was involved with for a short period of time was lesbian erotica.
Mm-hmm.
You said, well, isn't that just porn? I said, well, the thing about porn is that we all come from the male gaze, because it's every damn movie, every story, you know. I mean, they're very rare parts of entertainment, books or anything, where we are able to see what does it mean when women try to take back our sexuality, our bodies, the way that we look at each other when we're in same-sex relationships. All of that stuff is influenced by, you know, outside culture. But I did get together with other women who had come from the porn industry, who wanted to start seeing if they could create something that they were calling erotica, lesbian erotica on film.
Mm-hmm.
And what did that mostly mean? So I was involved in that, in all, not in front of the camera, but all the set designs, props, getting the casting. We actually had stories. It was like, I said, well, now what's going to make this really different? Other than they just met on the street and they ran into the bathroom and had sex. We had stories, and we started doing this. And this is literally when technology was around a Super 8, you know, 16 millimeters, Super 8 and things like that. And so that's part of, yeah, I was part of that industry. So I always kind of, and what we were doing with that, and the language became that what we were trying to do as women was become sex positive. So trying to make women feel good about their bodies. But I'll skip to something in that a lot of these women that had children that I was doing, they had daughters. Those daughters moved into so-called feminism. They decided to make it inclusive, and their so-called sex positive, how they interpreted that was to go into porn
Oh.
and to say that that was empowering. And so we went into this like, what just
Yes.
happened?
And I was part of that. I sort of got into this mindset that it was, you know, very empowering. And here I was, you know, really embracing my femininity, and it was bullshit. It
And
was really damaging. It was
I think we're
incredibly
about
damaging.
20 years apart. So that makes,
Yeah.
and there's the thing is that there were a lot of these women that thought they were raising these kids, you know,
Mhm.
to love their bodies. But
Right.
most
Yeah.
of
My
it,
mom was so sex positive that, you know,
mm,
anything goes. You know, if you want to, you know, go have sex in the bathroom during a party, that's just fine. And so it really was this mentality that, but what people don't understand is that women, there's a dynamic that happens when there's this sex positivity, that
mhm.
girls don't learn those boundaries, and those boundaries are so critical. So we're growing up now with this generation of girls that doesn't, you know, they don't have boundaries, and they feel that probably the only way to really get away from that vulnerability is now to become a male.
Yeah. 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 or completely give in to that, completely give in, right? And this whole thing that's going on now. So back to that woman in the community, and where I was going with that was the literal demise completely of a lesbian community that had come from being a thriving place. We were just setting it at, oh, this is great. And one of the only things that we had every year, which was like going to this film festival. And in Los Angeles, they started having the same thing. And these film festivals would happen all over the world because it was one of the only ways that somebody like in Melbourne, Australia, could see a film that maybe either came out of Australia itself, or maybe it was an American film of two women loving each other, two men out of New York, you know, having a romance, and it was a positive thing. Of course, there were negative stories as well, or very heart-wrenching stories. But the thing about this woman and what happened in the community is that she started doing that in '85. It got worse in terms of the number of young gender non-conforming lesbians that we saw doing the same thing, where they were not as lucky as I was. They went to a therapist who started to see this as something that was interesting. And I think that some of these psychotherapists had a very selfish agenda, and maybe there was some money, I'm not sure, that was starting to come, and the whole attraction of this machine that of course we started to see happen. And what came along with that was, all of a sudden, there wasn't just this one particular woman who, by the way, was just doing this odd profession. And we thought, why is she coming into the LGBT center to flex her muscles and talk about how it's great that she's in this thing? And this was part of the expansion of what, being a lesbian, because everybody knew she was a lesbian. And
She's
so it was this
doing gay
very
porn.
confusing.
So yeah, I mean,
Well,
yeah,
that's the porn thing was kind of, you know, it was that separate thing. We're looking at a body that's trying to
yeah,
pass as much as possible.
yeah.
And of course, the hair loss started happening pretty early on. As a matter of fact, I used to joke people when I said that I was going to be on that path. I had very thick, I have another picture here. I had very thick, you
Oh
know, a lot
wow,
of
look at
hair.
that.
A lot of hair. That's a gay
Wow.
day. That's a gay parade around
Wow.
1990-ish. And we saw about, there wasn't just her, there were literally by 1990, there were about 7 or 8
Wow.
fairly prominent women who had been these butch lesbians. And now they had sideburns, they had facial hair, their voices had changed, and all of them, they're starting to get hair loss. So when somebody said to me, why did you stop, Joey? And I just made a joke and said, I don't want to lose my hair. I don't think I'd look good bald. I mean, I'd shaved my head when I was 20. I went, you know, I don't want to do that again. So it was a joke, but of course it was much deeper than that. And one of the things that happened by 1990 is that I'm at the parade with my lover. There used to be one huge main stage that would be the culmination of the day, where there were speeches and bands and all of that. And it had started expanding to like more streets and spreading out. By 1990, you had your Mr. and Mrs. Smith from, you know, further out of the East Bay, even maybe with a couple of kids, coming as looky-loos, you know, tourists, because the parade had gotten so big and it was so inviting of everybody. And there's a comedian on the stage who was very prescient. She was a lot like a lesbian George Carlin.
Huh.
And she was making fun, and she looked out at the audience, you know, and she just cracked some joke, and she goes, hey, look who's come today. Hey, Bob, how you doing, Bob? And she just starts, you know, and of course there was nobody in particular, but she said, oh, this is great. You know, even straight people, they need to feel pride, you know, and everybody's laughing. And she said, you know, they've come out here, you know, it's good that they feel comfortable here now. And pretty soon, you know, it's okay, because we're not going to be lesbian and gay anymore. And this is when it had moved into the Lesbian and Gay Freedom Day. It moved from being just gay freedom. She said, and it happened 5 years later, she said, pretty soon, we're just going to become letters.
Oh wow.
And everybody kind of, and my lover and I looked at each other, because these are the private conversations that the
Wow.
political lesbians that I hung out with, we started talking about what were we seeing And even me, in the midst of still kind of feeling conflicted, knowing, I'm glad I had feminism as a basis, because it really kind of, I felt like it saved me. There was that analysis always kind of weighing there. She says, we're going to be letters. And then at some point, we're not even going to bother with the letters anymore. It's just going to be pride. Welcome to pride. And everybody started roaring. And she said, again, straight people will feel so prideful about their sexuality. And isn't that what we all want? Is everybody to feel comfortable? And everybody was roaring, laughing.
Wow.
My lover and I looked at each other. I felt sucker punched. And we looked at each other and I said, she's right. And she says, yeah, I know. And we turned around to start walking away. And it was one of those, like, this was the beginning. This is 1990. Now, what happened shortly after that, I'm going to show you something. This is not the actual thing, but I found this recently. This, I bought earplugs, and they're in a little metal canister.
Mm-hmm.
And these are these earplugs. And I saw this and I forgot that I had even gotten this, something that I ordered online. But if you can imagine this in a hard plastic and the same color, I got approached outside of when our bars died, which was pretty much around 1990. We were seeing the demise of all the lesbian bars, cultural centers. The only thing that existed, really, the bookstores were gone. So again, that meant that our places of women authors, not just lesbian, women authors would come. We're watching all this culture is going away. And I'm at these pop-up bars. They're the only things that happen, like on a Saturday night. They'd happen in the East Bay, occasionally in San Francisco. And the more gender non-conforming of us that were hanging outside of a bar one night in Oakland, this young sort of metrosexual guy, very hip young kid, looks like a sales guy. He comes around, hey ladies, how's it going? And then he goes, guys, like he was trying to adjust his language. And we were looking at him like, who are you? And he has this hard plastic container and he says, I got something for you. You guys want this. And I was hanging out with a friend who's probably no longer even alive. She would do any drug that was pretty much in front of her, except for heroin. She said, I draw the line at heroin. That was always the joke. And this guy hands her this thing and she starts to undo it and it's got pills in it. And she goes, hey, cool. What's that? And he says, it's what you want. This is what you've been waiting for. I will never forget these words. It's what you want. It's what you've been waiting for. And I look and she's starting to put him in her hand. He goes, go ahead. And I smacked her hand and I said, get the F out of here. I don't know where you came from. And he took off, much to my regret today, because I wish that I had acted interested. I wish that I had said, do you have a business card? Because it never occurred to me until after he was gone. I was like, damn it. And I'm smacking those things out of my friend's hand. And she's like, why'd you do that? She had some in there. There was still some in the canister. There must have been 20 or 30 in there. And she went like this. I said, you don't even know what that is. She says, as long as it gets me high, which goes back to why do any of us, has anybody ever been on that truck? I mean, she was in so much pain, right? Emotional
Did
pain.
she realize it was testosterone?
She didn't know what it was. The guy said, it's testosterone. He probably said it's testosterone. And I thought, oh my God. And then I'm thinking of that first woman that started, that helped. I mean, she didn't do it all by herself, but she was a huge influence. And then here I am, just 5-6 years later, and there were like 6 to 7 prominent women who were their exterior was changing. They were starting to try to go to college like that or do whatever, get a job. Some of them were thinking, I got fired. I don't know why I got fired. There was so much unchecked mental illness going on, right? And I remembered my lover at the time saying, this reminds me of people with anorexia. Mm-hmm. This reminds me of cutters. This reminds me of all this stuff, because we knew these women, every single one of these women, while some of them were more wonderful than others, there were a group of us that thought they needed help. They needed mental help for some reason. There was something going on, including that woman, which I have compassion for, by the way. But I watched the demise, and into the 90s as it got worse. And literally, it was like I'm being asked later with, Joey's just a nickname. I have a very feminine, legal first name, which I'm not going to reveal. But Joey, I had that as a very private thing among friends and my lover. And friends would say, you should just come out about it. Why don't you? I said, because I don't want anybody asking me if I'm trans or I'm going to trans. And then my name kind of got outed. It was a funny story, and then it did. And that was the first thing that strangers usually would ask me, are you going to trans? And I'd say, oh, so you think it's actually a process? What do you think the end goal is?
And how do you know if you've reached it?
But there's the thing, that's all I have to say. And usually it would be a lesbian. It would usually be a very feminine lesbian who had just encouraged her own lover. And this is where we are today, is that my brethren, my people, my former tribe, if you will, are the ones, again, we tend to circle the wagons around. When AIDS happened, back to a little bit of that, that's part of the reason that I feel the lesbian community went, because when our gay brothers were dying, we were at the height of all of the work that we'd been doing in the 60s and 70s with businesses and this, and starting to have people not trying to kill us all the time as lesbians. And AIDS hits late 80s, mid to late 80s. And San Francisco, again, I feel like ground zero for all this experimentation. And damn it, Big Pharma has them now. And Big Pharma has had gay men for a long time. And there's a handful of us that feel like there's a reason that it happened. I'm not going to get into that. But what did women do? Gave up everything, gave up businesses, gave up stuff of their home lives. I saw divorces go on, because what do we tend to do is, even I'm doing in my life now, keeping myself afloat, but trying to circle the wagons around these kids that I know that you and I care about. And women dropped everything and they started taking care of gay men who were having horrible, long suffering deaths. And I watched my lover drop a lot of things to be with one particular male friend, gay male friend that she'd had for years, to be with him. Literally, there was a circle of people. They just kept 24 until he passed. And so that's going on. And what starts to come into the community when this woman does what she does, isn't it interesting that just within a few years, we're being handed this for free.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, what hit me, Erin, was the Black community, the inner city Black community around the West Coast as well. And I know in Chicago and Detroit, and New York and everything. It's the Black community being decimated by crack cocaine, which at first is, hey, it's only $3 to $5.
Give it a try. It'll make
And
you
where
feel
were they
so
doing
good.
it? Outside of the Black bars.
Yeah.
Not outside of the churches,
Right.
outside of the Black bars.
Wow.
This is what you need. I got something that you'll like. $3 to $5. And I've talked with my Black friends about this specific thing, and we've shared stories. And you know that the following 2 weeks later, when I was at another lesbian pop-up bar, just for the night, it means they just come and they go. There's no regular establishment. Two friends of mine had heard about what my friend and I had experienced out on the sidewalk, and I came outside to join them. They said, one of those guys just left.
Oh, wow.
I said, one of those guys? And they said, oh yeah, you said a guy with skinny tie and all this. And yeah, and he had those little things.
Wow.
I said, what did you do? And they said, they told him to get out of there, hey, get out of here. But they'd only done that because they said, we knew if you came around and you'd be mad at us. But they would have taken it. And I
That's
said,
fascinating to me I think most people have no idea that it started in such an insidious way.
I can't find it anywhere on the internet either.
Yeah.
And I have reached out. I've only heard one lesbian in Los Angeles that knew that happened.
Wow.
And I asked my friends, did he give you a card? Did you find out anything? But all I can say in terms of the timing of that, the fact that there were a growing number, and I mean that 6 or 7 moved to literally about 30 to 40 in the in the mostly the city and the East Bay that we could see. And all of a sudden, as soon as young women, it was no longer the 2 years. It wasn't as quick as going to Planned Parenthood now, as you have exposed with that, and Brandon Showalter and the work that he did
Right.
around that.
Yeah. Yeah, and
Um,
for people who don't know, you can actually go to Planned Parenthood now, and on your first visit, just tell them that you're, transgender, and they'll happily write you out a prescription.
and no matter what age,
No
right?
questions asked, right? I
No
mean,
matter what age.
it's phenomenal. It's just outrageous. It's like the man with the skinny tie now has set up shop in the mall, and it's just easy as pie to go get it.
And where, now that we know because of the work of Jennifer Billick
Yeah.
and her blog site, the 11thhourblog.com, that tracking of the money
Mm-hmm.
is known worldwide now. And so I've been looking at, reading her articles and trying to go back to see when these invasions of particularly straight men, autogynephiles, who simply think if they show up in a dress and a wig, or they've grown their hair long and whatever, and now they're saying that they're lesbians. Even though I'm talking about San Francisco and the 85 to around 90 and then into the early 90s and the pills that I'm being offered, there was such a little thing every year that happened every summer in August called the Michigan Women's Music Festival that went on
Yeah,
for
I've always
40
wanted to go to
years.
that. Yeah.
Went on for 40 years, and it was a women-only music festival. They got it so sophisticated and so down that even women that had small boy children, they had a camp set up so that the boys and the kids could be close to, where the moms were and all that, so they could enjoy literally culture and music for 4 days in an all-women space. And what happened? A couple of autogynephilic men, one of them who became more than that, and his name was David Warfield, and that's right in California. I'm going to be going. Hopefully, I'm going to court to watch and see what goes on with this guy, because for years he set up a camp right at the gate, trying to pressure every year, trying to pressure. This started happening in the late 70s, 80s. It went on for years with men trying to pressure their way to be accepted as a woman and a lesbian. And who surrounded them and tried to also encourage the woman who ran the whole thing, let them in. They're really women, other so-called feminists and lesbians who said, he passes. And that's what I'm talking about with the trans, what we're seeing today with these people that say that they're trans, but they're gender critical. If they look enough like the very stereotypes that we think a man's supposed to look like and a woman's supposed to look like, this is today, this is not today, this is 1993. I'm going out for a date like I did.
Yeah.
That today people would say, oh, you were trans. No, I
Right.
wasn't.
Oh, they wouldn't just say you're trans. They would say you were actually a man at this point. That you
Well,
just
yeah,
by
I wouldn't have to do
looking like a
anything.
man, you somehow magically became a man. And I think, that's something that I've really struggled with, because there is this sense that if somebody passes, then we accept them. And in some ways, I just feel like that is, it's just incredibly regressive, first of all, to suggest, oh, he's pretty enough. Oh, he looks feminine enough. We'll go ahead and let him in. And what does that say about, women who are masculine looking? What does, what is the criteria now for being a woman? And does it mean that if I'm a woman who isn't attractive enough, that I'm no longer part of that club, that somehow I'm not a woman anymore because
Right.
I'm not attractive enough? I don't pass as a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And who determines what it is to pass? And it seems to me like it's sort of the sexualized version of womanhood that is what passes, that very few women actually look like. And so I find it just incredibly offensive that that's sort of the criteria now for whether or not somebody gets to go into a woman's restroom or locker room.
Right. Somebody that, wants to, a male who feels like the only way he's going to feel like a woman is to get his head literally cracked open, have bones shaved,
Yeah.
the brow lifts, Adam's apple. That's the kind of stuff that when you go back and people say, well, women do that all the time. They get boob jobs, they have false, they act like, people in general that haven't undergone surgeries like that. Yes, of course they've become more sophisticated. Yes, of course they are easier than they used to be. And technology's moved along. It doesn't mean that it's good for your body. And we all know that hormones over a long period of time, cross hormones, lessen your life. So you literally are saying, I'm willing for the comfort of other people. But now we have this language and say, well, I'm suffering from gender dysphoria. So there's my excuse. And what I'd say to that is, I understand that you feel, and this is what I want to say to any young people, because I've shown you pictures. I got one last one. This is me at age 25. And yes, that's a real stance for what I used to do when I hit the ball. But girls that look like that, that's okay. And that it's okay for you had Menno on, and I so appreciate that, because there is a man who was bullied as a child for being not quite boy enough or man enough. And that even women today who believe, and they may, whether they call themselves gender critical or not, they think that they are looking at this in a critical manner. And it stops at some point, because they do things like go on to a gender critical page on Facebook, and they have to feel compelled to post a Blair White video and say, I wish more men would listen to her. And it's like, what did you just do? What are you doing here? And again, it's usually women. We're usually giving it up. We're usually circling the wagons. We're usually trying to save ourselves and save children and save other women and all this stuff. But here were these women in Michigan surrounding not just one or two of these men. Now, Michigan allowed women, natal women, who said that they were trans, and it was known more as FTM at the time, female to male. That's when the woman back in 85, this new fad started to happen. It was called FTM, and it was a fad. And, they changed the name from double mastectomy to top surgery. Now it was cool. And they started talking about, I'm going to get bottom surgery. And it's like, oh, you're going to go under experimental mutilation surgeries to see if something works. And of course, things are better now, but we well know people that have almost died.
People have died. Yeah.
And they have died. Exactly.
Yeah.
And dying and it's like what I go back to always, and again, it was something that I was very happy to hear Menno say. I think that as older gay men and lesbians, and even straight women that have been the tomboys, and even men who are straight, who have been very soft, they haven't matched that, that thing of manly, that they're sensitive. Oh my God, that they like to go to plays or whatever the things are, that we gender everything, instruments, everything. That those people that have gone past 25 years old, past 30 years old, there I was still exploring past 30 when I'm having my lover tell me, I won't be with you anymore if you do that. And I don't support anybody. To me, it's ridiculous what we're seeing with this idea that I'm going to make sure that people under 18 don't get trans. It's like, really? But you're going to go out there and be who you are and act like you're one of these rare exceptions? I don't believe it.
It's a true trans.
I don't believe it.
I hear that term a lot, and I'm like, well, you might be someone who has given up on addressing your psychological problems and has decided to take this approach.
How dare you say that? Aren't you being transphobic?
I'm sure I am. But I think that what is even more concerning to me, and this might be an area where we diverge a bit, but what's more concerning to me is that as a society, we've accepted the concept that somebody can become the other sex.
Yeah.
And now it's like those NAMBLA people. I'm not even sure how you pronounce
NAMBLA. Yeah. I don't want to
NAMBLA
get too much
people
advertising. NAMBLA.
who tried to come to the parade. Now we're seeing any guy who wants to can say he's actually a woman
Yeah.
and have access to women's spaces and say, not only am I a woman, I'm a lesbian. And if you as a lesbian don't sleep with me, you're transphobic. And
Cotton
that
stealing.
you're being gender, or you're being genital centric.
Yes.
All
Yes.
this language. So that's where I see like, and we don't have the resources to circle the wagon and inject them the way you did at that parade. It's like they've just infiltrated, and they've brought Bob along. They've brought their straight, they've brought their straight allies along to back them up. And so now as a lesbian, you're just sort of at the mercy of this new movement that's basically erasing you as a category.
But Bob's been very clever. Bob doesn't bring Bob along necessarily. But this person doesn't bring Bob along. He brings Jane along. And there we have where women, it's the women, and it's the idea of that women can become men, and that there's a rare woman that literally should possibly be that rare creature that really does belong in the trans. And I've heard some of these people literally say, they make excuses and say there might actually be kids that are trans. No, nobody's trans.
Yeah.
But their whole thing is the logic, it doesn't make sense. They talk themselves in a circle, and what they really are doing is saying, look, I'm healthy and happy now. And maybe you will have to go that route someday, little kid that's under 18.
And I hate to say this, I have yet to run into one that is happy and healthy. Like they claim that they're doing, I had to do this, I feel so much better now. But then when you really dig deeper, they're not happy. They're not doing that well. And so I feel like it's almost, it's such a disservice to tell kids, to tell anybody that if you go this route, it might resolve those feelings, because I don't think it does. Even Johanna Olsen Kennedy, who's sort of the main butcher in all of this down in LA, actually amputating the breasts off of 13-year-old girls and giving cross-sex hormones to 8-year-olds. She's married to a woman who has gone through all of those treatments, Aiden, and even Aiden says that she still has gender dysphoria even though she's completely passing as a male. And so it's this whole myth that we're going to do all this stuff to you and you're going to feel better, but in the long run I'm not seeing it happen. And if you look at the studies, the suicide rate of people who actually go through all this is outrageously high.
Yeah.
So it's not resolving anything. If anything, it's just kind of trying to, you have this huge gash. It's like you keep covering up with something and hoping it'll go away, but it just gets infected and starts, going gangrene.
And until you get to the root of that, it's still going to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the thing. But that's what I say. I feel like, in a broad sense, the root of it is really self-hatred. And self-hatred comes for different ones of us for different reasons. But this specific thing about feeling this idea that you have it in your head that you're this new word now that people have, dysphoric, and they keep using it over and over. And I see YouTube videos with these young women who think, and they say, how do you deal with your dysphoria and this and that, while they're still taking testosterone? And it's like, throw the stuff away, learn to love your body. It's what you got. It's what you're here for. Even if you've already, I think of Sydney Wright, who we both know, and where she said, it's like, she said she got to a point, I'm going to sort of paraphrase, where you've already told your family and you've convinced people, and you've convinced everybody, and you get to a point, and I know she said for her, it's like you kind of, your pride was in the way.
Yeah. Well, and it's really hard because you've had all these people telling you go for it, and you've convinced them, I'm really a man. And then when you start saying, gosh, I did all this and it didn't work, now you're sort of, 3 steps back when you could have been working all that time to resolve these issues of self-hatred. And, instead now you've sort of like put problems on top of problems. And now, in Sydney's case, she's got some health issues as a result of.
Yeah, she sure does. She sure does. Do you know, Erin, the other trick of this is now that sort of like they've caught on, they're not using the language of I'm a man now. They'll say, no, I'm trans. They'll just say they're trans.